It began with a tremor so faint at first, few in the corridors of power even noticed. Not in the streets, not in the stock markets, but deep within the air-conditioned sanctuaries of Washington, D.C., where the world's financial fate is often decided behind closed doors. The International Monetary Fund, long seen as the untouchable guardian of global credit, had issued something unusual, a warning cloaked in numbers but vibrating with unease. The pace of debt accumulation across developing economies is becoming unsustainable. To the untrained ear, it sounded like bureaucratic jargon. But to those who understood the machinery of global finance, it was something far more dangerous, a confession of fear. Because beneath the sterile language of concern lay the unspoken truth. The old order was slipping. For the first time in nearly half a century, Africa had not just spoken back, it had acted back. From Ouagadougou to Bamako, from Niamey to Ouagadougou, a new sound was rising, not the echo of debt collectors, but the roar of defiance. We don't need the IMF, leaders declared. We will fund ourselves. And those words were not just rhetoric, they were revolution. What the West labeled fiscal recklessness, Africans called financial independence. What the IMF described as risk, the Sahel called redemption. In less than 2 years, a quiet miracle unfolded across the dust-red plains of the continent. Billions of dollars that once flowed outward in interest payments were redirected inward into homegrown investment bonds, gold-backed reserves, and sovereign digital credit systems now valued at more than $3.2 billion. A new kind of wealth was emerging, not borrowed, but built. For Washington, it was a shockwave. For Paris, an insult. For the people of Burkina Faso, it was liberation, a long-awaited divorce from the empire of debt, an empire not conquered by guns but by spreadsheets, not toppled by rebellion but dismantled by reform. And now, as the dust of this financial uprising settles, one question rattles the halls of every global institution. If the nations once defined by dependency can now write their own credit, their own currency, and their own destiny, what happens to those who once held the keys to their future? It's a question rooted in history, a history inked not in cooperation, but in control. For nearly half a century, Africa's so-called development was scripted by two towering institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, the twin pillars of what economists now call the post-colonial financial empire. Their contracts were masterpieces of polite coercion. Each loan came dressed as assistance, each signature wrapped in the promise of growth. But every dollar came chained to conditions. Structural adjustment programs, they were called. A phrase so elegant it almost concealed its cruelty. Privatize your public assets, cut your subsidies, freeze your wages, deregulate your markets, sell your land. Reform, they called it. But for millions across Africa, it felt like surrender, a slow-motion handover of sovereignty, written in fine print. By the end of the 1,990 seconds, the scars of those adjustments were visible from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Countries once rich in minerals and fertile soil were importing food from the very nations that had once borrowed from them. The dream of independence had been replaced by a reality of invoices. And yet, here we are decades later watching the unthinkable. The same continent once dismissed as the world's debtor is now writing its own credit. The same nations once told to adjust are forcing the world to adjust to them. It began with a tremor, but make no mistake, what's coming next feels a lot like an earthquake. Public hospitals lacked medicine, schools collapsed under unpaid teachers, and local industries were swallowed by foreign conglomerates buying state enterprises for pennies on the dollar. The IMF called it stabilization, the people called it strangulation through spreadsheets. How could stability exist when 60% of Burkina Faso's annual budget went to debt servicing, not to education, not to irrigation, but to interest payments measured in US dollars per minute? Then came a voice, calm, defiant, and untrained in the diplomatic caution of the global stage. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader from Burkina Faso, stood before his nation and said, "We do not need them to develop." It was not arrogance, it was awakening. For the first time, an African head of state called out the unspoken truth that the continent's underdevelopment was not a natural condition, but a managed outcome preserved through the language of debt. Could independence truly exist when a nation's budget required foreign permission? His words lit a spark across borders. In Mali, young economists began questioning why their gold reserves backed someone else's currency. In Niger, activists demanded audits of uranium contracts signed under IMF, supervised reforms. In Chad and Kenya, new coalitions of students and civil servants debated whether debt could ever be aid. Nigeria's parliament, once silent on international finance, began reviewing 12 billion US in legacy loan agreements. What had started as one soldier statement was becoming a continental dialogue, a reckoning with the very grammar of global economics. For decades, Africa had been told that prosperity required permission, that progress must be borrowed, not built. Yet now, across the Sahel, the silence was breaking. The language of dependence was being translated into the voice of sovereignty. And as the old guardians of finance watched their influence wane, a question echoed louder than any protest chant. If the colonies of debt finally learn to speak their own economic language, who then will write the next chapter of global finance? It began with optimism, the kind that often follows independence. In the 1,980 seconds across Africa, new governments were told that prosperity required discipline, that growth could only be achieved by embracing structural adjustment programs. The World Bank called them stabilization packages. The IMF described them as reforms for efficiency, but in reality, they were blueprints for austerity. Budgets were slashed, public companies privatized, social programs dismantled. Hospitals that once served thousands were forced to charge fees. Schools that promised free education now asked for payments. Within a decade, the continent's dream of liberation was rewritten into a contract of debt. In Ghana, the government sold national factories to foreign investors for less than 5 million US each, assets worth 10 times more. In Zambia, copper mines that once employed 30,000 workers were reduced to a few hundred. In Nigeria, the naira collapsed by 70% under IMF exchange corrections. By 1970 in part, sub-Saharan Africa was paying more in interest to foreign creditors than it spent on health and education combined, nearly 12 billion US annually. The numbers look neat on global spreadsheets, but in villages, they translated into hunger, unemployment, and silent despair. How could arithmetic, so elegant on paper, produce lives so disparity in reality? By the 1,990 seconds, the human cost was undeniable. Infant mortality rose in Tanzania and Malawi. Teachers left classrooms to drive taxis. Hospitals rationed electricity. Governments were told these sacrifices were temporary, a necessary phase for modernization. But decades passed, and the promised miracle never arrived. Instead, Africa's share of global trade fell from 6% to 2%, while its external debt ballooned to over 350 billion US. The IMF's formulas produce stability for lenders. For citizens, they produce dependency dressed as discipline. Could this truly be called development when progress was measured by compliance rather than capability? Then came 2020, the year that shattered illusions. When the pandemic froze global markets, Africa discovered how fragile its partnerships truly were. While Western economies injected $4 trillion US into their own recovery, African states waited for aid trenches of less than $2 billion combined, often tied to new loan conditions. Borders closed, supply chains broke, and nations that had been told for decades to privatize healthcare suddenly found themselves without masks, without medicine, without control. For millions, it was the moment of revelation. Debt was not a failure of management. It was a mechanism of control. Social media became the new lecture hall of liberation. Economists, students, and journalists began decoding the contracts once hidden behind diplomatic language. Hashtags like number debt is the new colonialism, and number Africa can fund itself spread faster than any press release. Videos breaking down IMF loan clauses in plain language reached millions of young Africans within hours. For the first time, economic literacy became a movement, not a subject. The continent was learning that numbers once used as shackles could also be weapons of freedom if understood and reclaimed. Then came the journalists. Investigative reports revealed how a large portion of African debt never actually left the West. Of every $1 billion US loaned, nearly $800 million was routed back to consulting firms, development contractors, and banks based in Europe and North America. The money returned home before it even touched African soil. In some cases, nations paid decades of interest for projects that were never built. Ghost infrastructures justified by polished reports and press photos. If 80% of the funds go back to the lenders' economies, is it really a loan or a circular trade of illusion? And yet, out of this realization, something powerful emerged: awareness. Across the Sahel, the new generation stopped apologizing for wanting economic sovereignty. Burkina Faso launched gold, auctions denominated in its own currency. Mali began auditing its foreign debt history. Niger initiated discussions for a Pan-African clearing house to process intra-African trade in digital francs and stablecoins backed by natural resources. Economists estimated that if Africa redirected even 15% of its annual resource revenue, roughly $120 billion USD, into local investment funds, it could match the IMF's total lending portfolio within 5 years. The old narrative that Africa cannot finance itself was crumbling. And as more citizens began tracing the flow of money from capital cities to offshore accounts, from aid budgets to foreign consultancies, the truth became impossible to ignore. The numbers that once symbolized progress had been the very chains of dependence. But now those chains were being broken, not by force, but by knowledge. Still, one question lingers, echoing across universities, ministries, and market squares alike. If Africa has finally learned to decode the arithmetic of control, will the world allow it to rewrite the equations of power? It is no longer the age of borrowed voices. Across the Sahel, a new generation of leaders has emerged, young, unafraid, and unconditioned by the corridors of Washington. Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, Aimigi Goita in Mali, and Mohammed Dey in Chad. 3 men from 3 nations, but united by a single conviction that sovereignty does not require approval. They are not graduates of IMF negotiation tables. They are graduates of reality, of villages that lived through austerity, of nations that learned the cost of dependence. Their rise marks a break in the cycle, a declaration that Africa will no longer ask for permission to exist on its own terms. When Traoré stood before his people and announced, "We will not beg for our freedom," it was more than rhetoric. It was policy. Under his government, Burkina Faso rechanneled over $450 million USD in foreign loan repayments into domestic investment, launching the country's first gold-backed stabilization fund. Mali followed, redirecting $300 million USD toward local agriculture and security, manufacturing. Even Chad, Ansea Quiet, partner of IMF reforms, began suspending debt negotiations in favor of bilateral energy partnerships. To the old order, these moves looked reckless, but to millions of Africans, they looked like repair, moral repair, economic repair, psychological repair. Their defiance was born not from pride, but from exhaustion. For decades, Africa had been told to do its part for global climate reform, despite contributing less than 4% of global emissions. When Western nations responsible for over 60% demanded that African economies slow industrial growth or risk losing green financing, the message was clear. The rich polluted, but the poor would pay. It was this injustice, mathematical, moral, and economic that solidified the Sahel's resistance. As Traoré put it bluntly, you cannot negotiate freedom with those who profit from your dependency. Could any generation that still remembers famine, debt, and silence accept such a trade again? The answer came not in speeches, but in silence. The silence of leaders walking out of IMF meetings, the silence of unsigned agreements, the silence of nations choosing to fund their own futures. These men understood that rejection of debt was not rebellion, it was self-defense. A nation that cannot control its currency cannot control its destiny. And so they began rewriting the rule book, thus building joint resource funds, creating cross-spur security pacts, and reintroducing state-owned banks to circulate wealth within Africa's borders. For the first time, the continent's young leaders are treating financial independence as a form of national security. They are proving that the most radical act in modern geopolitics is not confrontation. It is construction. The IMF once said Africa's economies were too fragile to stand alone. But if fragility can build its own systems, invest its own billions, and design its own future, then who is truly dependent now? The sound of change no longer comes from the chambers of lenders. It comes from the Sahel, where a new blueprint for African economic independence is being written in real time. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger once footnotes in IMF progress. Reports now stand as the architects of a continental awakening. Together they form the Sahel Alliance, a coalition built not on aid but on autonomy. Their motto is simple yet revolutionary. We will build our own systems. In Ouagadougou, the once exported gold now stays home. Refineries, once managed by foreign contractors, are now run by local engineers. Every ounce processed in country feeds into the National Development Fund, an account now exceeding 1.3 billion US capital generated not from loans but from the land itself. In Bamako, Mali State Mint has begun producing regional bullion coins for Interoff, challenging the decades-old dominance of the CFA franc. And in NMA, Niger's uranium exports are being renegotiated through joint ventures with African and Asian partners, ensuring that at least 60% of the value chain remains within the continent. Could this be the birth of a new African monetary architecture, one that trades dignity instead of debt? The transformation doesn't stop with minerals. Across the continent, the idea of self-reliant systems is expanding into finance and technology. The Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, PAPS, a new digital platform connecting over 40 central banks, now allows trade in local currencies, bypassing the need for US dollars or euros. In its first year alone, PAPS processed transactions worth over 2 billion US, cutting cross-border payment times from 5 days to just 5 seconds. In practical terms, it means a Burkinabe cotton exporter can now receive payment from a Kenyan buyer instantly. No foreign intermediary, no hidden conversion loss. What once took days of waiting and paperwork is now a click away. And every click keeps value circulating within Africa. Beyond the Sahel, the momentum spreads. Ethiopia recently signed a $600 million civil nuclear partnership with Russia, a deal designed to power local industries, not foreign grids. Zimbabwe launched its first AI factory, co-financed by Asian and African investors, aiming to develop regional machine learning models trained on African data. Kenya has become a laboratory for digital sovereignty, piloting its own central bank digital currency, the e-shilling, designed to strengthen local trade and financial inclusion. Each of these initiatives reflects a new psychological shift, one that measures success not by IMF credit ratings, but by ownership. For generations, African governments were taught that their development must mirror Western templates, that aid was generosity and reform was progress. But the post-2020 era shattered that illusion. When global supply chains collapsed, the world's richest nations turned inward, leaving Africa to fend for itself. And in that vacuum, something unexpected happened. Innovation. Across universities and cooperatives, young Africans began asking a dangerous question. What if we build systems that never need approval? The results are visible. Local banks in Burkina Faso now offer agricultural bonds backed by national resources, generating annual yields of 7.8% USD, equivalent attracting diaspora investors from Europe and America. Mali's sovereign wealth fund, once dormant, has doubled its portfolio to 4.5 billion US, channeling profits into renewable energy grids and water infrastructure. In Niger, 10,000 hectares of farmland are now irrigated through community-financed solar projects, a model replicated in Chad and Sahel. And its influence in the region. Charity experiments. Moscow has finally authorized a nuclear deal of a self-sustaining economy. Can a continent once defined by dependency become the prototype for post-global resilience? The deeper revolution, however, is psychological. For the first time, African leaders are redefining what it means to be developed. Success is no longer measured by compliance with IMF benchmarks, but by the ability to manufacture, refine, and decide. Independence, Traoré said in a recent address, is not the absence of aid. It is the mastery of value. His words encapsulate the new doctrine of the Sahel generation to replace assistance with partnerships and to transform borrowed capital into shared capital. This shift from aid to mutual investment is more than economic. It's cultural. It reclaims the dignity of production. When a Burkinabe miner refines his gold domestically or a Kenyan coder builds software for African trade, they are not just earning, they are rewriting history. The numbers reflect it. Intra-African trade has grown by 28% since 2023. And analysts project that if current trends continue, the continent could save over $40 billion USD annually in foreign transaction costs. The very systems that once drained Africa are now being redesigned to serve Africa. And yet, with every reform, a quiet tension rises. The question no longer is whether Africa can build its own systems. It's whether the world will let it. Because in the global marketplace, power is rarely surrendered. It's defended. As African nations turn inward to strengthen their economies, external interests grow uneasy. But perhaps that unease is proof that something monumental is unfolding. The end of economic dependency as a default condition. The Sahel Alliance is not merely rejecting the IMF. It is constructing an alternative civilization of finance, one rooted in the soil, spirit, and sovereignty of its people. It is proving that development is not a favor, but a formula, one that Africa can now solve on its own terms. And as factories rise, refineries hum, and payments flow freely across borders. A single question now defines the decade. If Africa can build a system of its own, not copied, not borrowed, but born from within, then who will dare to call it the developing world again? It was not the collapse that frightened Washington. It was the calm with which the Sahel Alliance declared financial independence shook the foundations of global policy. There were no riots, no revolutions, no fiery speeches, only quiet reforms. Gold, refineries humming in Ouagadougou, new payment systems launched in Bamako, and trade corridors expanding in Niamey For the first time, Africa's rebellion was not chaotic, it was organized. And that, to the West, was terrifying. In Washington and Brussels, the language changed overnight. What had been called a bold experiment became a sign of instability. Newspapers labeled the Sahel governments as anti-democratic, opaque, or rogue. Reports warned investors to avoid exposure in the region. But beneath the political vocabulary was something deeper: anxiety. For decades, control over Africa was exercised through narratives, not armies. If the story changed, if Africa began writing its own headlines, then the architecture of influence itself would begin to crumble. Could it be that what the West truly fears is not Africa's failure, but its success? In response, the World Bank announced a $100 billion USD stability and development package promising new loans for infrastructure, climate, and energy. But the conditions were the same old lines: privatization, liberalization, deregulation. The message was clear. The offer had not evolved. Only the wrapping had. Yet the Sahel Alliance did not bite. Their answer was silence. A silence louder than any speech. Because silence in diplomacy is power. It was the quiet confidence of nations that no longer needed to negotiate their dignity. Meanwhile, Western capitals launched what one analyst in Paris called a charm offensive. From Berlin to Washington, press conferences bloomed with new slogans: green partnerships, democracy re-engagement, inclusive growth for Africa. France announced a $2.5 billion green fund. Germany offered renewable alliances. And the United States proposed a new democracy fellowship. But for many African observers, it was déjà vu, a dance repeated too many times. These were not partnerships, they were attempts to rebrand dependency. The Sahel states listened politely, nodded respectfully, and signed new agreements with Russia, China, and the Gulf states instead. In Moscow, delegations from Burkina Faso and Mali negotiated direct trade routes for refined gold and agricultural exports. In Beijing, infrastructure deals were signed without IMF intermediaries, including a $1.2 billion rail corridor connecting Niger to Benin. And in Riyadh, the Gulf Investment Authority pledged $3 billion US for Sahel irrigation and digital infrastructure, structured not as loans, but as equity participation. For the first time, Africa was not begging for inclusion. It was choosing its partners. This shift from dependence to discretion is perhaps the most radical act of all. The IMF, realizing the tide was turning, tried to sound conciliatory. Officials spoke of maintaining engagement and supporting Africa's transition. Yet behind closed doors, internal memos leaked to regional media revealed a deeper concern, a fear of irrelevance. One note from an International Monetary Fund Policy Forum, quoted by a Kenyan newspaper, admitted that the Sahel's experiment, if sustained, could inspire similar trajectories in East and Central Africa. Translation: control was slipping quietly, elegantly, irreversibly. Western think tanks began debating a new dilemma: how to engage a continent that no longer needed to ask. Some proposed rebuilding trust through partnership, while others warned of losing influence to non-Western actors. Yet none dared to admit the central truth. Africa was no longer a marketplace of aid. It was becoming a marketplace of choices, where nations decide where to sell their gold, where to build their factories, and how to store their data. The balance of global power shifts, not by confrontation, but by correction. What makes this moment extraordinary is the tone. The Sahel governments did not respond to Western criticism with anger. They responded with construction. They built schools, highways, fiber optic lines, and power plants. They replaced rhetoric with results. When the African Development Bank reported a 6.8% regional GDP growth in 2025, most of it self-financed, it became impossible to dismiss the movement as a temporary populist surge. It was a model, a living proof that self-reliance can outperform supervised reform. The symbolism runs deeper than economics. In the 20th century, independence was declared through flags and borders. In the 21st, it is declared through balance sheets and contracts. And the Sahel's message to the world is crystal clear. Freedom today is measured not by territory, but by transaction. As the West scrambles to reconnect with Africa, it faces an uncomfortable realization. Its decades of lectures on governance and growth are now being met with quiet case studies of African-led success. The continent that once listened is now teaching that sovereignty can be practical, profitable, and peaceful. And so the question remains, hanging over every boardroom and foreign ministry from Paris to Washington. If Africa can achieve stability without permission, growth without loans, and progress without apology, what then becomes of the old guardians of global finance? The silence after rejection has turned into strategy. Once accused of lacking creditworthiness, African nations are now rewriting the definition of credit itself. The Sahel's economic revolution has entered its most daring phase one that transforms what the continent has always possessed in abundance, resources, into what it was always denied, capital. This is the era of resource-backed finance, a model that replaces dependency with design. Instead of waiting for approval from foreign lenders, nations now collateralize what lies beneath their soil. Gold, oil, lithium, and even agricultural reserves to generate their own domestic liquidity. In Burkina Faso, the idea took shape first. Using its national gold reserves, the government established the National Postal Bank, a homegrown institution backed by over 600 million US worth of refined gold. Unlike the IMF-driven systems of the past, its credit lines are directed towards small farmers, artisans, and cooperatives, the real engines of the local economy. Each gram of gold refined domestically now supports microloans circulating within national borders, proving that wealth can be mobilized without leaving home. In Nigeria, the same principle was scaled up through the Community Development Fund, seated with over 1.5 billion US dollars of internally collected revenue. Its purpose to finance local infrastructure, renewable energy, and agro-industrial startups by tying loans to real output instead of speculative assets. Nigeria effectively converted its oil and mineral wealth into a living balance sheet for its people. The result? A new ecosystem where citizens invest in their own communities, not through aid programs, but through profit participation. Can there be a more powerful symbol of freedom than a nation funding its own future from its own soil? Farther south, Zimbabwe embraced a hybrid path, combining technology and raw material sovereignty. Partnering with investors from Asia and Africa, Harare launched the AI and Technology Center, a $400 million USD hub designed to process data, train local engineers, and develop resource management software for mining and agriculture. Its core logic is bold yet simple. Whoever owns the algorithm controls the value chain. By fusing its lithium exports with artificial intelligence research, Zimbabwe is proving that the next frontier of independence lies not only underground, but also in the cloud. Of course, no transformation is without turbulence. Institutional inertia, bureaucratic corruption, and external pressures still haunt these initiatives. The temptation to return to easy loans remains. Western analysts sounded the alarm. Reports filled with cautious language, operational risks, lack of fiscal discipline, unsustainable models, the same recycled vocabulary of doubt that has echoed for decades from think tanks in London and policy halls in Washington. But this time, their words landed differently, because something profound had shifted not in balance sheets, but in consciousness. For the first time, millions across Africa understood the oldest secret in the history of money: wealth never disappears. It only moves from one set of hands to another. And once a people grasp that truth, once they see how easily their gold, their oil, their land, and their labor have fueled distant empires while leaving their own cities in darkness, there is no going back. Awareness, once born, cannot be buried. Across the continent, a new generation of economists calls this awakening the resource renaissance. They are not waving flags of isolation, but banners of negotiation. This is not about walking away from the global economy. It's about walking into it with both eyes open. As one young analyst in Accra put it, if our gold can stabilize the dollar, if our oil can secure Europe's winter, why can't those same resources secure our own future? It is a fair question and a dangerous one, because the answer threatens to rewrite the script of global power itself. The real revolution sweeping through Africa is not being fought with soldiers or slogans, but with spreadsheets, satellites, and silicon. The battlefront is digital infrastructure, renewable energy, financial autonomy, the tools that turn raw resources into sovereignty. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, new banks are rising on African soil. Digital payment systems, coded by African engineers, are replacing colonial currencies. Gold-backed national reserves are no longer fantasies, but functioning realities. Across the Sahel, money no longer flows through Paris or Washington before reaching local markets. It circulates within, strengthening from the inside out. And hovering above it all, a question both thrilling and unsettling begins to form. If Africa has finally learned to transform its resources into real currency, who will ever dare call it poor again? History, after all, does not always roar. Sometimes it rebuilds quietly in factories instead of protests, in policy rooms instead of revolutions. What we are witnessing today is not a rebellion against globalization, but a redefinition of it, a rewriting of the terms. Africa is no longer asking for permission to stand. It is standing to participate on its own conditions, in its own language, through its own systems. This is not isolationism. It is integration with African fingerprints. From gold-backed sovereign banks to cross-border digital payment systems, from community-owned investment funds to networks of technological sovereignty, the continent once known for borrowing is now designing its own architecture of freedom. Still, the old world cannot let go easily. Western commentators continue to predict collapse, recycling outdated models that never truly captured Africa's complexity. They quote GDPs, deficits, and ratings, but fail to measure determination, innovation, and pride. Because on the ground, a new rhythm hums through construction sites, solar grids, laboratories, and refineries. These are not the symbols of rebellion, they are the blueprints of reconstruction. This is Africa's most radical response to centuries of economic dependency, not revenge, but rebuilding. As Captain Ibrahim Traoré once said, "The strongest loan is the one you never need to take." And beneath those words lies a philosophy capable of shaking the financial foundations of the world. Because this is no longer just an economic movement, it is a moral awakening. Africa is proving, day by day, that dignity can be monetized, sovereignty can be systematized, and partnership can exist without submission. The message is thunderous in its simplicity: cooperation, yes. Control, no. And as the old financial empires watch the cracks appear in their marble columns, the question that lingers is not whether Africa can stand, but whether the world is ready for an Africa that stands tall. So perhaps this moment is more than just history, it's a reckoning. Is this the true independence the continent was once promised, or the dawn of a new balance of power where Africa writes the terms? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain. The conversation about Africa's rebirth is not ending, it's only beginning. Save this story. Share it. Because decades from now, when historians look back, they may say this was the decade the world changed direction and Africa held the compass.